Hi, my name is Dr. Rayshawn Ray, aiming to speak truth to power, and this is my daily thought. Why does it seem that police kill black people with impunity? With impunity is without cause, without regard for a person's well-being, for their life, for their care. The fact that you can shoot someone and not try to perform CPR, not try to come to their aid, not say, oh my gosh, I just shot someone, right? After I make sure that they don't have that weapon that's actually not there, let me try to actually save their life, right? I mean, that's what we saw this week with Terrence Crutcher, as well as what happened in Charlotte, North Carolina, and what's still going on in Charlotte, North Carolina around protest. Obviously, with Terrence Crutcher in Tulsa, the police officer has been charged with manslaughter, given recent incidents related to Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray. I mean, it's, I don't think people have faith in the system that things will actually work out and we'll see justice, right? One big thing I'm hearing in conservative spaces is, oh, well, he was on PCP, right? He was trying to turn his life around. I don't care if he was turning his life upside down, right? At that point, that man had his hands up and his window was closed and he did not have a weapon. And the police officer shot him at close range, thought she discharged her taser, and killed this man. I mean, that's what the video shows. It's really, really simple, right? And then in Florida, we have a white man who killed people and was eating someone's face who was on drugs, and he was not killed. We have a terrorist who was taken alive after setting off bombs on the East Coast, right? We have Dylan Roof, who killed 9 black parishioners in a church, and police officers took him to Burger King on his way to jail because he was hungry. This is what we are talking about, right? And I hear also something people saying, oh, well, police officers have biases too. They're humans too. Well, of course they are. This is the problem, though. Police officers are supposed to be above reproach, right? They're police officers. They took a police oath to treat people equitably, regardless of race. So if they have these biases, these are the sorts of things that need to be worked out, right? And the justifications that people have is even more insulting. So one main justification I hear for why we see police killings is that blacks commit more violent crime. Well, this is the thing. Blacks are definitely committed more or actually convicted, arrested, and convicted more of violent crime, right? But whites are actually more likely to engage in other types of violent forms of crime, like aggravated assault, right? And we never really talk about those sort of things. Regardless of this, blacks are not a homogeneous group, though we are treated like one, right? So blacks are not one group, right? All black people are not responsible for all black people. I mean, there are over 30 million black people living in the United States. Though we only represent 13% of the population, that becomes very, very key to think about. What that means, and I'll talk about this more at a later date, is that less than 5% of blacks have committed a crime, right? A violent crime. Right? Now, it's about 3% for whites. So yeah, when you compare blacks to whites, blacks are more likely to commit violent crime than whites. But we're still talking about over 95% of black people are not committing violent crimes. That's the whole point, right? There was a New York City study done looking at stop and frisk. Donald Trump just came out and supported stop and frisk. That's a horrible idea. Stop and frisk was actually ruled unconstitutional by the New York Supreme Court, right? And partly the reason why is because a study found that 9 out of 10 people stopped by the police were not doing anything wrong, did not have a previous criminal record, did not have any drugs or other forms of contraband, guns on their person at the time they were stopped. And yet and still, half of the people who were stopped were black, and most of those individuals were roughed up and harassed by the police officers, right? So stop and frisk isn't working, right? If stop and frisk was working and black people were that violent and that criminal, then we wouldn't see 9 out of 10 people not doing anything wrong. Instead, we would see 9 out of 10 people doing something wrong. So over 90% of the people, which corresponds to the stat I just gave about violent crime, is the fact that over 95% of black people are not committing crime. Right? Instead, all of us are treated as if we are criminals, right? And the problem is that it's blackness that's doing that, not necessarily individuals' actual behavior. And that's something we should really, really talk about, right? Like, for example, another narrative I hear is that, oh, black people should be responsible for black crimes in black neighborhoods. First off, What does crime on the south side of Chicago have to do with me or the millions of other black people who don't live there? The south side of Chicago, white people who live in Chicago are more responsible for the crime that's happening on the south side of Chicago than black people are who don't live there. And we know that what's happening on the south side of Chicago has a lot to do with segregation, has a lot to do with poverty, and has a lot to do with labor market discrimination, right? The same things that they found in Baltimore and Ferguson are the same things they will find in Chicago and Charlotte. This is the reason why these cities are responding similarly, is because people don't have jobs and they're treated like crap by the people who are sworn to actually protect them, right? And so the other thing is that oftentimes there are some white people who can't tell black people apart. So what that means is that they actually can't decipher the differences between a person who looks like they might be engaging in criminal activity and the 95% of black people who actually are going about their daily lives, going to work, going to pick up their kids, right? The way that the man was killed in Charlotte, going to pick up his kids, right? And then the whole point of the book issue, whether or not it was a gun or a book, I think we have to take this to a broader level. We have to aggregate what's going on. Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, who's a psychologist at Stanford, has done a series of studies around implicit bias. I really encourage people to read her work. She's a MacArthur Fellow, which means you are essentially anointed as a scholar, and you receive $1 million to do research in a particular area because the MacArthur Foundation anoints you as a genius, right? One of her studies, she compared black and white men, and she put inanimate objects in their hands. A book, a cell phone, nothing, a gun. What her study showed was that people were more likely to pull the trigger. So these were people acting as cops, simulating, I'm a cop, would I shoot or not shoot? So the same simulation that police officers go through during their training. What she found was that people were more likely to pull the trigger on a black person that had an inanimate object like a cell phone and a book than they were a white person that had a gun in their hands. So we see this playing out with what's happening in Charlotte, right? We see this playing out in what happened with Alton Sterling in Louisiana. We see this playing out where we hear officers say, I thought they had a gun. Well, they didn't have a gun, right? And people need to start being held accountable for that. You can't just shoot someone and kill someone because you feel threatened, right? There are a lot of things people are scared of. One of my kids is scared of dandelions. That doesn't give him the right to go out and step on all the dandelions and kill them simply because he's scared of them and they haven't done anything to him. Right? But that is essentially what we are doing with crime in our country. On a personal level, I know this, not just doing research as a sociologist, but I've been stopped over 30 times by the police and I don't have a criminal record, right? And many of those stops are probably not recorded by the police or part of public record because oftentimes police officers just kind of jump out. They're called jump outs. They stop you when you're walking down the street. They stop you when you are going into a different neighborhood, right? And so we see the way that those sort of things are being played out. So part of the narrative, the other narrative is that people assume that being stopped means you did something wrong. That's not true, right? Blacks are stopped all the time just for being black, and the statistics prove it. I just mentioned the NYC study. You could also look at the Ferguson Department of Justice report. You could look at the Baltimore Department of Justice report, right? But for some reason, people think that another narrative is that we're only talking about the ones who hurt people. No, this is the thing. Black people are concerned with crime just like any other group, right? And they don't want to see anyone hurt just like anybody else. We're not talking about the ones who are committing violent crime. I just talked about that less than 5%, right? Just like it's about 3% for whites. We're not talking about them. We're talking about the overwhelming 95% who aren't committing crime, who are still treated like they are. That is the group that we're talking about and the group that we're concerned about. I'll give you a few examples. In my hometown of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, Joseph Sushake was changing the oil on his truck in his driveway. Police come by. They're looking for a suspect. They start talking to Joseph Sushake. Next thing you know, he is arrested, brutalized, beaten, and ends up being in the hospital for not committing any crime. Now, you might say, oh, well, they were looking for someone who fit his description. No, not in the least. They were looking for a young Asian man. Joseph, at the time, was a 58-year-old black man in overalls and oil, changing the oil on his car. If we look at the last two incidents that happened in Charlotte and Tulsa, police were on their way to something else. They saw this man broken down in the middle of the street and they stopped at that point. You would think that the police are coming to help, right? Instead, they ended up killing this man, right? In Charlotte, they were going to do something else, looking for someone else that did not fit that description, right? And we're still waiting on the video evidence because, as the chief said, well, we can't really see if he had a gun or not. See, these are the things that gets dicey for people. You hold information. Individuals say stuff that people don't think is true. These are the problems that people are having, right? You have Robbie Tolan, who was coming back from hanging out with his cousin and pulled into a nice neighborhood in a suburb in Texas, either in Houston or Dallas. Robbie Tolan played minor league baseball. He was in AAA, was probably about to go pro. His father played professional ball. He pulls up in his driveway. The police pull up and say, yeah, we got a report that a suspicious vehicle was riding in the neighborhood. He's like, I live here. My parents live here, right? All of a sudden, an altercation ensues. Him and his cousin are forced face down in the driveway. The parents come out like parents normally do. And it's like, what's going on in my driveway? The police approach Robbie's mother aggressively. Robbie is standing up saying, leave my mother alone. He's shot, right? He's in the hospital. He no longer can play baseball. Right? These are the types of things we're talking about. LeVar Jones was being followed from one side of the street to the other. He was going to get gas. Should he have had on his seatbelt? Sure. But how many times have you went across the street to a gas station or busted a block and not put on your seatbelt? Probably a whole lot of times, and you probably didn't get pulled over for it unless you look like LeVar and myself, right? So at that point, the police officer says, let me see your ID. LeVar says, okay. He reaches back in his van to get his ID. The police officer says, what are you doing? And shoots him. And LeVar says, why did you shoot me? And the police officer says, I don't know. Right? The man who was taking care of his autistic patient in Florida got shot. And he asked the officer, why did you shoot me? And the officer said, I don't know. These are the types of things that we're talking about, right? Compliance does not lead to people being treated equitably. That's another narrative. People say, well, if you would just follow directions. Philando Castile followed directions. It got him killed when they asked him for his ID. LeVar Jones was asked for his ID. It got him killed, right? These are the sorts of things that we are talking about here. Compliance does not equal individuals being treated equally, right? And so when we hear Terrence Crutcher in Tulsa being called a big bad dude, when we hear a police officer say Philando Castile fit a profile because of his nose, right? When we hear police officers say, I don't know why I shot or I meant to deploy my taser, or in Oscar Grant's case in Oakland, he was handcuffed with his hands behind his back and the police officer shot him. This is how implicit bias operates, right? Why should your hands be up if you haven't done anything wrong? But see, this is the thing. Just maybe, after all this stuff, all this research that we do around implicit bias, all the work that I'm doing around implicit bias, maybe that's not what it is. Maybe there are just some cops that actually want to kill a nigger. Like with Walter Scott. He's running away, and the police officer unloads on him. Jonathan Farrell had a vehicle accident, comes up to a house for help. She calls the police because she sees a black man, says he might have been trying to come in. I think if he was trying to come in, when you open the door, he would have came in. And when police come, he's going to them because he thinks they're here to help him. And a police officer unloads his gun on him. There are kids playing at a pool in Texas, right? And police officers show up, see a bunch of black kids. He's telling them to leave. They're like, why are you telling us to leave? We're not doing anything wrong. He pulls his gun on them and throws a teenage girl on the ground. There's a girl in a classroom who doesn't want to leave the classroom, who is clearly disturbed. A police officer comes in, picks up her desk, and throws her on the ground. These are the types of incidents we are talking about. Police officers use black men's mugshots for target practice. This is what we are talking about. San Francisco police officers are recorded and have text messages where they are calling black people monkeys and niggers. This is what we are talking about. So possibly they just don't care about us. They just don't care about our bodies, our minds, or our souls. So why do we act like this isn't America? This is what America does. All this controversy around the flag and the Star Spangled Banner. This is what America does. America was born and bred on vilifying blackness. We can't change a system that was never meant to include us. It must be dismantled, deconstructed,